Jezus. Ik wil niet meer dat. Nou, er zijn nog mensen die kunnen komen. Ik ga dus nog staan, is dat hoor?
Ja. Still some people. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Great to see you all. I hope you've had a good lunch break, and great to see so many of you here. I would like to welcome you all to this session on global climate justice, a report. Of course, many sessions today are about global climate justice. This session is in relation to a recent report by the Advisory Council on International Affairs to the Dutch government and parliament. My name is Jorrit Opperwal. I'm a counselor to the Development Cooperation Committee at the Advisory Council. The Advisory Council on International Affairs is an independent body advising the Dutch government and parliament. So today we are here to discuss our new report on climate justice. And let me quickly introduce our speakers. We'll first have the chair of the Advisory Council, Bert Koenders, former Minister of Foreign Affairs, who will present the report and some of the main findings and conclusions and recommendations. Then we'll have a few additions by Annelies Somers, professor, who is the chair of the Development Cooperation Committee at the Advisory Council. And after that, we have two very distinguished guests to share their reflections, either on the report or on global just transition in general and how the Netherlands could contribute to that. We have online joining us Fatima Denton. Thank you so much for joining us, Fatima. Fatima is director of the United Nations University Institute for Natural Resources in Africa. And I think she's joining us from either Ghana or the UK. Yeah. So it's great that she can be with us online. And then we have Mohammed Shahim, member of the European Parliament for the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. So thank you so much. And after that, we hope to have enough time for Q&A with the audience. So having said that, I would like to introduce Bert Koenders to... Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jorrit. Fatima, welcome to the Africa Day. We have to add that Fatima is also holding the Prince Claus Chair in Equity and Development. We are very grateful that she's coming to our meeting this afternoon. I'm a little bit in a difficult position because I'm chair of the Max van der Stoel Foundation, which is progressive and left, and of the Independent Advisory Council. Nevertheless, I think many of you, we'll see in the discussion, might like this report as something that fits very well with some of our thinking in our political movements. But obviously it's made by an independent organization that advises the parliament and the government, as Jorrit was saying. Thank you very much. First of all, this report that we will present today on the Africa Day is written out of a big concern. A concern that climate justice, that equity and just transition is by far not getting the attention that it deserves. And for that reason, will be one of the reasons that it's very difficult to reach the Paris goals. It's an urgent report, but it's not a negative report. Let me underline that. We have in the report many ideas, many initiatives that are already there. And there are many people from the African diaspora. We have activists from Uganda and from Ethiopia that you will meet later afternoon, who also are working, in fact, on some of the big adaptation and mitigation ideas that are also present in the report. Let me start with an important cliché. That is that climate change is a global problem. And the political and social debate in our country, the Netherlands, we see that also in view of the upcoming elections, we place almost exclusively attention to the national dimension. And in this report, we're going really to talk about international climate justice. We know that in the Netherlands, there's some movement now in the area of climate change and the area of making strong recommendations and actions both to mitigate and adapt to climate change. It's not enough, we know that, but Dutch emissions have started slowly to go down. And I think also climate justice in the national debate has received more and more attention. We see that also in the upcoming elections. Who is actually going to pay for the mitigation and adaptation to climate change? And that is part of our electoral debate in this country. It's, I think, seen by many as unfair that low-income households who have contributed the least to the problem end up paying the cost of climate transition. That's a debate we have in this country, and we'll see what happens next Wednesday. But what we want to underline here is in this new advisory report that this analysis is equally applicable to the international dimension of climate change, and that it requires much more attention of the Dutch government, of the European government, Commission, Parliament and others, and also of our African partners. We have actually identified, and I'll go quickly through the report so that there's also time for discussion, a triple international climate inequality in terms of causes, in terms of consequences and access to solutions. The first is about climate inequality. Developing, many African nations barely, we know that, contributed to the problem. And it's still very interesting to look at the facts and the figures because they are overwhelming if you think about them. They're startling. In historic terms, the Netherlands has emitted more than almost all countries of sub-Saharan Africa put together in historical perspective. But even today, the inequality persists. The per capita emissions of the Netherlands are 40 times as much as in Tanzania. It's a staggering figure if you think about it. We know it's much more, but it's 40 times more. By January the 8th, I like these statistics because they might make exactly clear what we're talking about. The average resident of a rich country has already emitted the amount of greenhouse gases that the average resident of a low-income country will emit during the entire year, the 8th of January, very early in the year. Maybe the last telling statistic, I think it's important to convey that. Our total emissions in this country of 70.8 million people are larger than those of Nigeria, the largest African country with a population of more than 200 million. So these are the facts. Inequality in terms of contribution to the problem. Second, consequences. That's the second inequality. For many countries, and not only the island and small states, but in many parts of the world, you see right now that the consequences are hardest in those countries at this moment. The climate crisis is not for tomorrow, it's for today. And there are many examples. Jorrit, who has been one of the big authors of this report, knows it from his own time, I think, in Mozambique. If we look to the cyclone in Mozambique, we saw it wiped out just 20% of the GDP. Now, not all weather patterns are obviously related to climate change, but many are. And there's also scientific proof of that. We can give you many other examples, and you know them, and Fatima, I'm sure, will talk about it. Pakistan is, I think, a very good example. I've just been involved very much again in Afghanistan, the country we seem to have left in terms of attention. There's enormous dire needs, especially for the women and girls in that country, but it has a major climate problem. And it's a problem that's there. So the second inequality is the consequences in developing countries. The third is, and that makes the triangle so difficult to deal with, is that developing countries have least access to the capital that is needed to finance the solutions to climate change. So they cannot properly protect themselves against climate change, which is already relevant right now, as I just indicated. But of course, these are countries, especially the low and lower middle income countries, that actually still have a need to make sure that people grow out of poverty in a sustainable manner. So for them, it is absolutely key that they also contribute to the element of not only adaptation, but also mitigation. And for them, it is extremely difficult to invest in this at this moment. It's almost a Faustian choice. Either you invest in your health, in your education, in employment, in value chains that make a difference for this enormous growth of a younger population, especially in Africa, or you pay off your debt. We have a situation in the moment, for those of you who've been longer around, of a renewed debt crisis in Africa, of a financing problems. I was just reading some figures that the premium in terms of interest rates to borrow for interesting green projects is up to 10%. Can you imagine? So the risk premium and the consequences for this. So to invest in sustainable growth or in climate adaptation or in mitigation, there is an enormous issue of a Faustian choice to be made by those governments. And I want to underline that because it leads to a force issue, and then I stop with sort of the analysis of the inequality. That is the fact that if you look to the results, and you look, for instance, for a country of the Netherlands, and you compare to the whole of the African continent, in terms of renewable energy, capital investment at the moment in Africa is 40 times lower in Africa than it is in the Netherlands. It's quite a staggering figure. So we are really now looking at a very unequal distribution of the future benefits of the transition. And this is compounded, you could say, by some of the very big concerns that we have at the moment in the world around not only interest rates, debt levels, but also the consequences of the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East on many of the countries in the south. So we're getting into a sort of an idea of unjust transition, to say the least. What does it mean? And I'm going to the next slide, Jorrit. There's three big consequences of it. There are many more, but in view of the time, I will limit it to this. First of all, because of these reasons, last but not least, the ones that I mentioned about capital and stranded assets and so on, is the delaying of international climate action. Without external support, developing countries simply do not have the resources to be able to invest in sustainability because of the other pressing problems: infrastructure, energy, education, healthcare, employment, food, etc., etc. So if there is not, and we know that, and we come to the figures in a second, not sufficient external support added to obviously local tax receipts, the climate transition in low and middle income countries will not gather sufficient space. And therefore, if we do not put enough energy in justice, in just transitions, then simply it will be impossible, because so many countries are still in the process of getting out of poverty, to reach the Paris goals. It will simply be an impossibility, and therefore also not, if you would look at the self-enlightened interest of our own interest here in the Netherlands. Second, if this happens, if there is a lack of climate justice, it means, in my view, without any doubt, even if it's not always in every case a direct relationship, but it will lead to more poverty, instability, and conflict in the most vulnerable countries, which can also threaten peace and security. I have my own history in West Africa. I've seen it in Mali. It's a very complex problem in the Sahara, but in the end, the ethnicization of the conflict between herders and farmers and the wrong policies, both from the West and from the local government, lead to this issue of rising insecurity, and it becomes part of a whole geopolitical fight. The third element is, and I hear that in many parts of Africa, let's be open about it, is a growing disenchantment with the West of double standards. Again, there, it's a big issue we can go into by detail, but I think it's pretty obvious if you look to some of the issues we have now around warfare and the world conflict in Russia and in Gaza. It's obviously that there is an issue of global resentment in the ways that knowledge is shared. Fatima can say a lot about it, but also in the decision-making structures. And it means that for some countries, it is awkward to see that they feel that European countries are lecturing them on CO2 emissions, on fossil investments and deforestation. Well, the European countries themselves, at the moment that there is a crisis, immediately say, yeah, but we need more gas. And that is a dilemma, which I understand, but it's a bit awkward if at the same time you put very strong conditions on other countries. That is a sense of double standards. Now, without going into all these details, let me say what we recommend, because there are also positive signs of change. And I think it's important that we quickly go before I stop to some of these recommendations, so you know at least what we want on the basis of this analysis of the triple inequality and consequences that are pretty severe, especially for the lower and middle income countries, but also for ourselves, for the reasons I just indicated. Then I think there are a few issues that we really have to look at. Let me first say, and I say that a little bit beyond my role as president of the Advisory Council to the government, although we include recommendations on this, but I think it's a very important point. It is not something about old-fashioned development cooperation, but it is about also capital flows and sufficient amount of investment in solar, in hydrogen, in wind, in other value chains in which African countries can contribute positively to employment creation, whilst it is being made very difficult for them. And in that conundrum, I think it is absolutely unacceptable at the moment we have elections in this country where at least one political party is basically saying the whole development cooperation part we can get rid of. It's only humanitarian aid. I can say that even as part of an independent organization, we're basically abolishing almost a whole department, including the knowledge about water, about the environment, about how to contribute to risk financing in other countries. I just want to mention that clearly, because after all, Fatima, forgive me, but we are in elections here in next year. I have to say that at least as part of the Max van der Stoel Stichting. And that brings me to the point that there are many recommendations, and they're definitely not only in terms of development and the 0.7 and the 0.1. But I want to say that it is very clear that if you make international commitments, and the need for finance is enormous, both from public and private sources, and they should be geared, in my view, more to the low-income countries and some of the lower middle-income countries, and not only for mitigation, but definitely also for adaptation. We need a professionalization and a higher level of capital flows to some of these countries. And therefore, I would recommend again that we do, and we have recommended that also to our government, stick to what you have promised, 0.7 and additional climate finance. It's an element of it which is not unimportant. Second, if you want and talk about the real big figures, and unfortunately they are big figures, and they come, yes, from local taxes and from capital markets and from public international flows. Let's make sure that if there is such a feeling of disenchantment in many countries of Africa because of this climate injustice, then it's important to go with some of the recommendations of the reform of the international financial institutions, including SDRs, expanded possibilities. There are great initiatives from different sides that you see. Let me just quickly go through the recommendations. They are part of it. First of all, of course, we call for this reform of the global financial system. I think the Bridgetown initiative of the Prime Minister of Barbados is important. I think, again, this country, the Netherlands, which has a long history in multilateral finance, in also being critical and at the same time part of these larger international institutions, make sure that this issue of climate justice, of practical programs, of working on the basis of a demand on the other side, to work on special drawing rights and including on stricter regulation of international carbon markets to guarantee just outcomes. The next one I think is important. For a long time, those who've been involved in development know that mostly in the recommendations to countries in Africa, the advice was don't get into industrial or sector policy. With a little bit, let's be very open about it, a certain arrogance, you can't do it. You can't pick winners. Your capacities in the government are not enough. It's not wise, do it around to comparative advantage. Consequences of all this is that Africa is mostly linked still to the old division of labor. What we propose here, and our members, and there may be members of that group of development cooperation of the AIV here, is give them a chance also to have sectoral policies on green growth in many African countries. That needs a completely different attitude. We do it ourselves. In the US, in Europe, in Japan, we have now major industrial policies that we didn't have a few years ago, and which I think is positive, to go to more green growth. investment, coordination from the government. Can we please also have other countries give an opportunity to do so? Make sure that the value chains that are about green growth are something that are linked to what is possible in Africa, and we put quite a few examples of that, how that could be done in practice with very pragmatic programs, but also with how you could work on local processing of raw materials that are also important for the green transition. And all the critical materials that are in countries like Congo, and we know how difficult that is. The third is this whole issue of professionalization of environmental policy in terms of ministries, capital flows, and knowledge. We are in favor of some of the cooperation programs in the green transition, like countries like Germany and others do with South Africa and with India. I think we should do, as the Netherlands, also something like that in Africa. My last point is this. If we have a triple inequality, if the issue of climate justice, finance, ways of doing things can be successful, there are two other things that we have to look at in this part of the world. One is coherence policy. It's a nice word which we have in these FMS meetings already for the last 25 years. If we have a green policy in Europe, which I think is very positive and to be strengthened, and we see a fight of some countries and some parties who do not like it, but in the end it's the start of a European Green Deal. So let's make sure we don't do this in a way that is negative for developing countries. It's very good to have a border adjustment tax, because then we know that companies don't go quickly where you can easily pollute. But do we give also a chance to others when it comes to protectionism, towards the sectoral policy, towards to a rising protectionism that might make it very difficult for countries in Africa to have a similar approach? Let's make sure that what we do here is positive for what happens there and vice versa. And I'm very much, we can leave that for the discussion, for the definition of more equitable partnerships. I think it's possible. I think it's needed, especially because of work creation in Africa. And the second is, I was very amazed. I'm not sure that everybody who comes from the outside realized that, but we had a minister here of Foreign Affairs, one of my successors, who was not known to be very keen on climate policy, but he changed his mind a little bit when he became the leader of the climate team in the European Union, which I admire. Somebody can find out the truth a little bit late in life. And I think we should follow him. Well, he has now led the way. Also a bit for the AIV, I'll tell you. I didn't expect that beforehand, but he basically said, of course, we have to make sure that if there is one world, there is poverty and inequality, there's an issue around the creation of work and labor markets and so on and so forth. If we want to work in a way that it is more equitable and sustainable, then we have to reduce our footprint more drastically than we have thought so far, so that there is a possibility for others to grow sustainable out of poverty. That's a reality. We can get around that. And to say that we have put forward some ideas how you could limit in 2040, that was the idea of Wopke Hoekstra, reaching our goals in 2040 rather than 2050. We think it's possible. It's also been advised by the European Council of Scientists around it. But I think we should work on reducing the global footprint of our own country. We know that some of our own consumption and production patterns place a disproportionate burden on land, on raw materials and water resources elsewhere, with some of the negative impacts on biodiversity and forest cover. In short, therefore, it's important also that we put more strict rules, standards and goals on this issue. I think around these three, Jorrit, and you are quite part of the recommendation team, and they're much more worked out in detail. I think we can deal with this triple problem of inequality. The difficulty, if we don't deal with climate justice internationally, we're definitely not going to reach the Paris goals. And the fact that we have very concrete initiatives to make sure that there is actually a possibility to work on this. And I hope, therefore, at least for the next Dutch government, but also internationally, we will talk to the delegation that will go to the conference of parties in Abu Dhabi. We can contribute to that. And there will be lots of other discussions about the role of China, obviously, maybe some of these Gulf states could do also a little bit more on climate finance. After all, we see an inequity there as well. It's in the UAE, so why don't they pick up the role on climate finance as well? But these are things we are going to discuss. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Bert, for this overview of the report. And I would like to ask Annelies Zomers to quickly share her additional points.
And I'm sure that Jorrit tried to say also quickly, because time-wise, it's important at least to have enough time to listen, indeed, in particular also to Fatima and Mohamed. But I was asked, indeed, to give some background information about the report, which is, of course, also important because this has been a collective effort that has taken 1 year. Many people have been very actively involved. Dorette Corbeil is sitting here, and also other colleagues, etc. Bram van Oyck is also sitting here. So that makes it easy also later, if we still have time to respond to questions, there are more people in the room that can help responding the questions. Background, very quickly. So we had, in our report, we tried to take, or to make use of all the scientific reports that are there, also the reports of other advisory boards, WRR, etc. But I think very important that we had interviews with more than 50 people representing different stakeholders. And for this particular case, we also talked to people, international group of people, including Fatima Denton. And so that's the reason why I find it very important to listen also to how they read the report. Maybe the only thing that I would like to highlight about the analysis that we made is that we came across many different perspectives, 6 different perspectives, but it is, of course, not so difficult to make 8 or 10 or 12 out of that. And it made us aware, not only how complex it is, but how necessary it is to have a holistic approach. Because thinking about climate change, you have people who say, well, it's all about planetary boundaries and how to prevent that we go beyond the tipping points. But of course, not at all costs. So we don't want that to happen at the cost of poverty, for example. You have other people say, well, it's all about rights, human rights. If we take care of the human rights, then we are doing fine. But that is, of course, also too simple because you don't have you have one human rights, but you have very many different groups, etc. And nowadays, it's not only about humans, it's all about nature, animals, etc. So also there, you need a very open-minded approach. You have people who say, it's all about solidarities. Let's just collaborate. We are a solidary world, but we are very much aware that solidarity is not very compatible with, for example, economic interests, etc., and it does not go fast enough. You have people who say, well, we need just policy, just trade, for example. But we also know that that is also not going fast enough because it is often voluntary based, and we need rules, regulations. We should also push harder. And well, I'm probably forgetting 1 or 2. I'm looking at Jorrit, who indeed was the principal, the first author. But I think about the perspectives, and that is the bridge also to Fatima. We should be aware that from the perspective of many southern countries, it is an opportunity. It's more seen as an opportunity. And it was already mentioned also by Bert, of course, climate change, all the investments that are nowadays being prepared should not come from us, etc., should not follow our logics and our needs, etc. It's very important now, indeed, with a new type of communication with the countries that we will engage with, to start new partnerships, etc., and to indeed think of investing in such a way that, on one hand, it satisfies agendas in the countries that should set their agenda, and it is an opportunity to create the necessary employment, etc., etc. So it is very important. I'm not. Yeah, maybe I'm going to, because I'm very short now. So the recommendations are very straightforward, because of all the recommendations we point at ourselves, and indeed we need to stop and to reduce our own footprint, not for doing good, but for the sake of the climate agenda, but also for the sake of ourselves, because our future will be dependent not only on how we deal with this within our own borders, but what is required is indeed an active engagement with all those other countries that we are linked to through our trade agenda, etc. And what is required is indeed a new conversation that starts at the other side. So Fatima, I'm very interested to listen to you and take it from there and make sure that change will take place. And that's the reason why we are here. It's only on paper. It's a paper. It's a document. It starts here. So we are aware also at the IFA that a report is not enough to make change, but it starts here. And I'm very happy to see that there are so many people, because that is not what you expect when you listen indeed to all those interviews about the elections, etc. So I'm optimist now. And I give back to Jorrit, and I'm looking forward to listen to Fatima.
Thank you, Annelies. Excellent. Then indeed, let's quickly, the time is passing quickly, so let's quickly give the floor to Fatima. Fatima, the floor is yours to share your reflections. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Jorrit. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much. And thanks for the invitation. I'm very grateful to be part of this conversation. I listened with great interest when Bert and Annelies were presenting the report, and I also read the report with great interest. I want to start off by congratulating you. The report is actually very powerful in the sense that it covers quite a range of issues that are very much, I would say, topical issues, but also issues that are essential to this conversation on justice and on climate action. So I feel that a lot has already been covered. I want to make a few points. Some of them I think would reinforce what I had from both Bert and Liz, and some which I think might maybe just stand a little bit apart in terms of strategies for moving forward. And these are just my observations. I have no pretension to offer advice, but just my own observations. So I think one point is important. And for me, it's the very fact that we are in a very fragile world, I would say. The fragility can be seen in so many areas. It's not just the biophysical, but also, I guess, fragility when it comes to our own development goals that are at the same time tangible and intangible. I'm talking about peace and how important it is. And we're actually taking it for granted, because a lot of the aspiration that we have for a just transition cannot happen in the absence of peace. And that talks to the current crisis that we see even in the Middle East, not forgetting other crises in Ukraine, in Russia, etc., and other parts of the world where crises have been somewhat forgotten. So I'd say to a large extent, I have a sense that this quest for a green trajectory puts us all on the same path. In a way, it's almost as if we're all developing countries, because none of us have got what it takes to get to that trajectory, to be able to get to that green, this green terrain. So we're all, in that sense, developing our plans and developing our policies. So I think that that's a very good thing, because it means that we can put ourselves on a bit of a level playing field, even if we know that the field is not that leveled. The other point I wanted to make is bearing in mind that the report does cover quite a lot of things, from justice to issues around value chains, etc., and also just highlighting some of the Achilles heel of climate change and climate action at the moment, and pointing to issues around climate finance. But I wondered whether moving forward, both in terms of your policy in the Netherlands, but also your policies towards the countries that you want to remain in solidarity with, how can a report like this be presented? And in that case, I'm thinking about both the interlocutor, your interlocutors, your message, as well as your messengers. And how can you bring all of these things together? So I'll start with the first thing, and I think Bart alluded to that. We are operating in a very, as I said, fragile state, but in a fragile space where trust is broken. So I think our first task is to see how to mend that. And mending it is not so easy, but it's certainly not insurmountable. So I would say this is an opportunity for many countries in the developing world and in Africa to re-envision their development. This is a continent that is very much dependent on natural systems. I mean, and in that development of natural systems, there is a lot of possible harms and manifest harms that we can see in terms of some wrongs that will be difficult to reverse if it's not corrected now. So this is a wonderful opportunity to turn a new page, I'd say, to a development paradigm that would be fit for purpose and that would also make room for future generations. And I think that in that sense, the way you position yourself and how that opportunity narrative is pitched would be very essential to be able to bring African players on board. There is definitely a sense that many countries in Africa would need to look at ways of diversifying their economies, because that diversification of their economies, I think, will potentially give them the kind of sovereignty they want, especially in terms of food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, not least because a lot of the climate sectors are already considered as sensitive sectors. Especially for countries that are very, very much dependent on agriculture, on tourism, on forestry, and all of these are sectors that are under the assault of climate impacts. So I think talking to countries in Africa and positioning, or I would say having a pitch, a message that is very much framed around what are some of the lessons that Africa can learn from this, and how can those lessons support a new vision around diversification, around value creation. And I think many African leaders would tell you that they want to move away from this path of dependency. Countries like, I would say, Zimbabwe or even Namibia do not want to just use their critical green minerals as some kind of a conveyor belt of production where they just produce and that product is not, they're not adding value. The product is being shipped off to somewhere else where value is added and profit is maximized. And I think the point that Bart made about having local, I would say, local innovation, but also industries that can be part of that value creation is going to be quite fundamental. So that they move away from this sort of extractive-driven economy to an economy where it's a bit more circular, but also an economy where it's more regenerative and where they can actually see some of the benefits. So I think that is also a very important part of that message that I would say is important. But also to say you want to avoid the wrongs of the past. The part dependency is part of a colonial history. and countries need to move away from those sort of misguided policies. And so putting themselves on a pathway that they're not now going to start investing in what could possibly become ivory towers, because investment in oil and gas, as lucrative as they can be perceived today, might very much end in stranded assets. And this, in many ways, is not going to benefit, huge swathe of populations, which have never really seen the benefit of oil and gas. The richest countries in terms of oil and gas, be that Nigeria or even countries like Gabon or countries like Angola, are not countries where the profits of these resources have been distributed across the population. A lot of it has gone into capital flight, and a lot of it is what constitutes an enclave economy. So I think very important to see how we position ourselves in a way that enables the continent to see this as part of a new development pathway and a new development that would get them out of the past wrongs, but also position them for future growth. The second point I want to make very quickly is to say this conversation is important with African countries being complicit in this debate. The tendency for just transition right now is that the conversation is being appropriated even to the definition of just transitions by people that seem external to where the problems might probably find scale. A lot of what we are talking about, even in terms of energy sovereignty, food sovereignty, has possibly a lot more room in an African continent and in other parts of the development world, because at the moment it's not there. So the energy systems are undercapacitated. There is a huge degree of energy poverty. So the solutions will grow a lot faster in a terrain that is very much likely to benefit from it. But that solution cannot happen in the absence of the people that are part of it. And so the appropriation of definitions, the appropriations of solutions, the appropriation of planning and designs and even policy need to go back to those very people. And that's where I feel that there is a problem, because quite a lot of times I feel that issues around definition and around framing have been somewhat misappropriated, I would say. And that is also not a positive trend. And just maybe another point, which I didn't see so much in the report, but which I think is actually important, is around the point that was made. I think it's made, but I think it needs to be probably a bit more visible, is looking at the aspect of trade. So it's made in terms of when we think about the EU Green Deal, and Bart referred to the CBAM and some of the opportunities there, but also some of the potential missteps that could happen if CBM is not executed properly. But I also want us to think about countries that rely a lot on trade, that rely a lot on where they have high export concentration in climate sensitive sectors like fisheries, as I mentioned, like tourism, like forestry. That will see a loss of these resources, both in terms of fiscal deficit, but also in terms of their productive capacity. So in that sense, I would say the conversation also needs to come full circle, so that we're not just looking at it from the point of view of richer countries, developed countries, but looking at it also from the point of view of poorer countries, and the possible trade deficits that they will incur if their goods are basically left on the table. And let's not forget that these countries do not have access they're not full participants, I would say, to the multilateral trade systems. You know, they're not very often able to have the access that developed countries have in terms of their goods and services. And so they will be equally or even more hampered if they don't have full access because of the fact that the climate extremes and environmental degradation is disabling their possibilities for livelihoods. But also, I think one last point on this, just to say, in as much as we're looking at trade, it's important that we also look at aspects of co-benefits and trade-offs, because sometimes that seems to me a little bit hidden. And I think in this aspect of just transition, or the injustice of the transition, we need to be able to see all the possible injustices, all the possible blind spots, so that that can also help us in the way in which we shape and design policies moving forward. So I would want to probably not go too far into the conversation, because this is meant to be a debate. But just one last point. My work with the Prince Claus chair is very much centered on the notion of power, and trying to understand how that in itself is a deal breaker, and to a large extent, how power, especially when it's not recognized or when it's misrecognized, how that can be a barrier to some of the potential climate action that we're looking at. So I would just want to say that the power lever, how we understand it, how we recognize it, how we make it visible rather than invisible, is essential to how we arrive at a just transition. And in the paper, it talks about how if we don't do just transition properly, we might end up delaying the process of the transition. But I would also like to say that if we don't do just transition properly, we might potentially lose out on a bigger transformation opportunity. And if we don't do just transition properly, I would also say, we might also have a multiple tiered system where some people are way ahead of the curve and they're racing, and others are way behind. And those that are way behind might probably, because of the fact that they haven't got the pace or the scale, we might find that we might have to play catch up, because we might need to go back and fetch them. Otherwise, the transition would not go at the speed and the scale that we want to see. So for me, the injustice of the transition is multifaceted. It's not just around pace, it's around speed, it's around scale, it's around transition, but it's also around innovation. If we don't do it properly, we're depriving a whole generation of potential innovation that they could bring to the table, that could drive us to that transformation that we seek. So those are the points that I would like to put forward, very much conscious of time, and I don't think I want to take more time to get into the other very important points that were mentioned by both Annelies and Bert. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fatima, for those reflections. That's very insightful. It's a shame that an hour is so short. We're going very fast, but I would like to now invite Mohammed to share his reflections.
Thank you very much. To be fair, I think your contribution, Fatima, was so complete that I will focus a bit on the European angle, because I do believe that when we talk about the just transition, it's multi-angled. I think one of the key elements is acknowledgement. When I go to the climate conferences, acknowledging that we did something problematic and we should be at the forefront of trying to solve it. I think that's very important. Second, when it comes to, instead of only writing reports, let's not only talk the talk, but walk the walk. Let's show other countries that we can decarbonize our economy. Let's show that we can mitigate a big part of the problem that we've caused. And the third one, which is I think very important, is we should not use this energy transition. We should use it to decrease inequality. So we should make sure that other countries can develop with us, can have access to climate finance, so that they can invest also to decarbonize their own economy. It's in our interest to do so. A solar panel is in an African country much more efficient and cost effective than in the Netherlands. But still, we have much more access to these technologies than in those countries, which doesn't make any sense. Another element for me, which is very important, is that when we create mechanisms like the carbon border adjustment mechanism and any other, let's say, product requirements or legislation, we need to assess what does this do with the supply chain? How can we make sure global south countries can use this framework to improve their economy so that it's not a way to push them out? One way is, and this is something we need to do on a European level, let's create funds on a European level. Let's coordinate with other rich countries so that we can give access to these technologies. I would not want to see the Netherlands having their own policy, because that will be a Dutch interest policy approach only for the Dutch industry. The same happens for Germany. Please, let's do it on a European level. Let's create a global gateway which really decreases inequality and gives access to funding, not only loans. Loans are okay, to be fair. If it's for mitigation and if there's a business case, we should de-risk. We should make sure that companies, private companies can invest. We should take away all barriers. But when it comes to adaptation, there's no business case. And this is also, I think, an essential point for climate justice. We've caused the situation and we need to make sure that people living in these areas can live in a bearable way. And we should watch out what type of words we use. Because we should not add insult to injury when it comes to climate justice. When people say we need to help the Africans because else they will come to us, that's adding insult to injury. It's ridiculous. That's for some right-wing politicians a motivation to then act. For me, we should act because there's perspective, because we can create equal partnerships based on equality, not based on a colonialism 2.0, based on making sure the supply chain or the value chain partly stays in those countries and not only extracting of critical raw materials and then creating an economic value here in, let's say, in the Netherlands. That's not how we should have a sustainable development model. And for this, we are developing these just energy transformation partnerships, but they need to have real access to finance and a real inclusion of local communities. That's what I would add, and that's what I will fight for in the European Parliament, I can promise you.
Thanks a lot, Mohammed. So that's great. We've had 4 great interventions, which took us almost to the end of the hour. But there's a coffee break after, so we can anyway continue the conversation. But people, we won't want to appropriate your coffee break. But let's see if we can quickly do a couple of questions. I think there is. If there is a microphone, we can.
A question to the panel, but also to Ms. Fatima. When you talk about decisive say over the economy, which is, I think, the crucial point, shouldn't we speak about socialization and democratization of the decision-making process, the decision-making on the use of the means of production and the product thereof, so therefore to democratize the economy? And we do not hear that anymore. That's the old labor point of view. And the second question is whether, if you look at Russia and at China, who are no longer communist, who are autocratic capitalist regimes, what is their influence in Africa? I heard that the government of Suriname in South America sold parts of its territory, the rainforest near Amazon, to China. Is China buying up territory from African government and economical elites? So are they actually selling their own people's land? And the last thing I wanted to ask, which I have forgotten, I think 2 is quite enough.
Okay, then let's keep for now these 2 questions. I think the first one was specifically directed to Fatima. So Fatima, please, if you have any for a quick answer. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for the question on democratization. Yes, I think the only way we can get out of this this problem is by being as inclusive as possible. So to me, democratization is the heart of where we need to go. And to a large extent, I guess, the critics of neoliberalism, for instance, are of the view that it doesn't allow for that kind of democratization that we would like to see. But I think we are all in agreement that our current system is not actually geared to the change that we want to see. And so in that sense, we need to deliberately and intentionally find ways of how we become more inclusive. And that's why I was talking about the need for framing this question in a way that allows for people to be part of the solution. And that can only happen when you democratize things. And the democratization has to go way beyond that. How we democratize our energy systems, how we democratize our food systems, how we are more intentional about our deliberative participatory processes in terms of decision making, so that it's not just an elite group that are defining things for the rest of the world, but that everybody is part of these definitions of where the solutions are. So yes, I completely agree that it has to be democratized. On the question about Russia and China, I mean, to a large extent, there's a lot of geopolitical implications where climate change is concerned. And I think Bert touched on some of that. A lot of governments in Africa are leasing their land to China because there is a sense that that will come with maybe more efficient results in terms of degraded lands and turning those land into profit-making entrepreneurial activities. But that also has a cost. It has a cost to local communities because very often they are displaced and they now have to go and look for new homes and new activities, and sometimes they're not exonerated properly. So there are political economy dimensions around the big players. But I also don't necessarily want to just focus on Russia and China, because I think that we are all culprits in this conversation. There are many culprits in the north as well as in the south as well. So I think that we all have a duty of care towards our environment, but also towards future generations as well, in terms of reversing some of these trends. Thanks.
Thank you. Does anyone of the panel here want to add something?
And time-wise, we should...
yeah, we should. I think we can take one more question after this, and then we should go for our coffee.
Is it working? Not, eh? Yes, yeah? Yes. Okay. Just also reflecting on Mohamed, and I think our report is for our government, and of course part of the recommendations target Europe, and indeed the Green Deal, there we can make a difference. At the same time, I would like to also use this moment to remind us that we might be small, but we are also huge in terms of footprints ourselves, but also in trading. I think the future of the Netherlands is made in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. It will have enormous implications for ourselves. Thus I would also keep it with ourselves and use our report also to start discussions with our own government to be more responsible where it comes to our trading, our investments, etc. At least to be precise in knowing the impacts, etc., and start a conversation on the basis of equality. That is what I wanted also to reflect on based on what you said.
Thank you, Annelies. Yeah. So let's see if maybe one more question before I see. Yeah. Let's go here in front. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it is.
I only see the first row, so apologies.
Oh, too late. Thank you so much for all the interventions. They were really insightful. Although there was something I was missing a bit in the report. You talked about we should allow Global South to have green growth, but that seemed a bit futile unless we talk about debt cancellation in Global North and unless we talk about a bit of degrowth in Global North. Because, we cannot say that, oh, Global South can have green growth unless they stop producing stuff for the Global North. So unless Global North needs less, we cannot have green growth in Global South. So a bit on that.
I just would like to underline your points are very key, and maybe we should even put them even more stronger in the report. They're there, basically by saying we have to put our own goals earlier in the time, because if you want to call it degrowth or different growth, we can have a whole debate on that, but it's very clear that our footprint will have to be reduced earlier than 2050, exactly for the reasons that you mentioned. Secondly, on the issue of democracy and socialization, as you mentioned, I think we in the report, the different instruments, the subsidies, there is the market, there are rules, and there is democracy. And I think we have the honor of working very closely with Fatima Denton, who is now the Prince Claus, to think about democratizing around the debate and the instruments. We know that, for instance, if prices simply get higher because you incorporate the cost of environmental damage, that also has immediately an inequality consequence. So you have to think that through. We work more now with market instruments, which is not necessarily bad, but we should do much more also on the rules, what is forbidden and not. But at the same time, I think the issue of democratization is absolutely key. We want to reach out in this, and I think, as Fatima said, there is almost, if you want to use it, a historic moment to work differently with Africa and have much more equitable partnerships. Both because Africa is, I mean, China doesn't do that much different from what we did for many years, by the way. I mean, I have the same criticism, and the criticism is there in Africa as well. You go to Kenya or other places, Fatima, and you hear an enormous criticism of the way Chinese investments take place and all these kind of things. But they're not that differently from what we have been done for many years. So you don't want to make Africa, and they won't allow it, by the way. That's the advantage of the emancipation of many governments. Just being a yard for geopolitical interests. And therefore we will have, and this is the plea in this report, and I really believe in that it's possible, in terms of value change, employment creation, as you mentioned, a possibility to work in a different way. And that's where we are trying to make a bridge, realizing that Africa comes from an unequal starting position.
Yeah.
With concessions to multinationals, the problem will never be solved. And if you want to shrink to the 1960s level, you have to socialize radically, because otherwise...
Yeah, that's one point of view. I think there are elements of that might be wise. I'm not sure that's so automatically solving the problem.
Wasn't born.
Okay, it wasn't 60.
It's an interesting conversation. It's an interesting conversation that will certainly continue. Unfortunately, our time has now run out, but I would like to thank you all very much. And we are here, and in the coffee break, we can continue our conversation. The Dutch report has been published and is ready. There's a couple of copies here for those interested, not many, but a couple. Otherwise, you can also get in touch with the IFA through the website. You find the general email, so if you have questions or you'd like a copy, please do get in touch. And the English version will be published very shortly. So thanks a lot, and enjoy your coffee break.
Yeah.